What if feeling different was never the cause? What if it was the consequence? What if you started feeling separate from people long before you were ever alone? And what if that happened because you kept noticing changes before anyone else could see them? Because maybe you've experienced this. A conversation continues normally. People keep laughing. The room keeps moving. Nothing changes on the surface. And yet somehow you already know something has changed underneath it. Most people think loneliness begins when people disappear. But maybe it begins much earlier than that. And if that's true, one question becomes impossible to ignore. When did the distance actually begin? Maybe it started with a conversation. Not the words, the space between the words. A hesitation that wasn't there before. A curiosity that quietly disappeared. A warmth that suddenly felt rehearsed instead of natural. Nothing dramatic enough to explain. Nothing visible enough to defend. But something changed. You felt it immediately. Then came the strange part. You looked around expecting someone else to notice it too. Nobody reacted. Nobody even looked confused. That moment changes observant people, because a dangerous question appears. Was it real, or was it only visible to me? But that still isn't where separation begins. This is usually where self-doubt enters the story. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I'm reading too much into things. Maybe I'm too sensitive. But sensitivity often receives blame for perception, especially when perception arrives early, because being early feels almost identical to being wrong. At first, you don't notice endings. You notice beginnings of endings. You don't notice conflict. You notice pressure building toward conflict. You don't notice people changing. You notice direction changing. Suddenly old memories reorganize themselves. Conversations make sense years later. But noticing something alone still isn't enough to create distance. Something else has to happen first. You're probably thinking about someone specific right now. The friend who stopped sharing things before they stopped showing up. The person who stopped asking questions before they stopped caring. The relationship that changed temperature long before it changed form. At the time, you couldn't explain what felt wrong. Now you probably can, because you weren't reacting to an event. You were reacting to movement toward an event. Observers often live slightly ahead of evidence, and living ahead of evidence creates a strange kind of loneliness. Not because people reject what you see, because they haven't arrived there yet. But even that isn't where separation begins. Eventually, something unexpected happens. You stop trusting yourself, not because you were wrong, because you were alone. Those are completely different experiences. Being the only person seeing something changes the way perception feels, especially when reality takes months to catch up. By the time everyone else notices what you noticed, another habit has already formed. Negotiation. You negotiate with your instincts. You negotiate with your observations. You negotiate with your own experience. And perhaps that costs more than people realize. Because underneath self-doubt, another feeling quietly starts growing. Not isolation. Something much quieter than that. Perceptual distance. The feeling that conversations happen on one level while you're experiencing another. The feeling that people discuss events while you're noticing trajectories. You aren't looking at different people. You're looking at different timelines. That dinner suddenly makes sense now. Everyone laughed. Everyone smiled. Everything looked normal. And somehow you already knew something had changed. The room didn't change. Your relationship to the room changed. That realization changes everything. Because maybe seeing too much doesn't make you different. Maybe it slowly changes where you stand. But the biggest shift is still ahead. This may be one of the strangest experiences observers describe. Being surrounded by people while quietly feeling alone. Not excluded, not rejected, not abandoned, present, but separate. Almost like everyone else is standing in the same room while you're standing a few moments further down the timeline. You hear the same words, watch the same events, see the same faces. Yet somehow the experience feels completely different. Perhaps separation doesn't begin with distance. Perhaps it begins with asymmetry of awareness. If these videos keep giving names to experiences you've carried quietly for years, you may already understand why this channel exists. Most people believe being different creates separation. But what if the opposite is true? What if separation creates the feeling of being different that changes the entire story? Because suddenly this stops being an identity problem and becomes an experience problem. You didn't wake up different one morning. You accumulated experiences that slowly changed where you stood. One conversation, one friendship, one room, one realization. Until eventually you looked around and felt something impossible to ignore. You still belonged physically, but psychologically something had already moved. And maybe that is exactly what the thumbnail captured. The frightening part wasn't feeling alone. It was realizing you felt alone while everyone was still there. That changes the experience completely. Because now loneliness arrives before loneliness exists. Distance arrives before distance exists. The separation begins before the separation becomes visible. No explosion, no argument, no dramatic ending, only accumulation. Small moments, small signals, small shifts. Most important changes in human relationships arrive quietly, which means observers often meet change before everyone else does. And perhaps that is why so many people remember the feeling, but not the moment it started. Some discoveries don't feel powerful because they teach us something new. They feel powerful because they finally describe experiences we've carried for years. Recognition feels different from information. Recognition feels like language finally catching up to memory, like fragments becoming patterns, like scattered experiences becoming maps. Some ideas feel familiar the moment we meet them, not because they are obvious, because they finally give structure to something we already lived. If you've ever experienced that feeling before, you're probably not alone here. But there is still one question left unanswered. Perhaps this explains something else too. Why many observers slowly become quieter? Not because they have less to say, because translation becomes exhausting. How do you explain a room changing? How do you explain trust fading? How do you explain distance before distance exists? Eventually, silence becomes easier than explanation. Then people misunderstand the silence itself. Cold, detached, uninterested. When often the truth is much simpler. You don't know how to explain experiences that started long before anyone else noticed them. There is probably someone in your life who understands exactly what that feels like. Observers often recognize each other through experiences rather than similarities, through patterns rather than personalities, through recognition rather than introductions. Maybe that's why some people feel strangely familiar immediately. Not because they are identical to you, because they are standing in a similar place on the timeline. If someone came to mind while watching this video, that probably isn't an accident. There is probably someone in your life who has felt this and never heard it explained this way before. And perhaps they need these words as much as you once did. Because recognition spreads differently than information. Maybe the problem was never that you were different. Maybe the problem was believing that seeing things early should feel the same as seeing them together. Perhaps what you called difference was simply distance in time. You didn't leave people behind. You noticed movement before they noticed movement. You noticed change before they noticed change. You noticed distance before distance became visible. And maybe that changes the entire story. Because if seeing too much created the distance, what happens when observant people stop hiding what they notice? For many observers, that isn't the end of the story. It's the moment the real story finally begins.